Let me call the hearing to order. Good morning. The committee meets today to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine. This hearing comes at a somber moment as we mark 1 year since Russia launched its illegal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine. I'd like to welcome and thank the expert witnesses before us today. Dr. Angela Stent is Director Emerita of Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. She is an expert on Russian and European geopolitics with extensive policy experience across the intelligence community, State Department, academia, and NATO. Ms. Dara Masiko is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. She specializes in Russian military strategy, combat operations, and escalation dynamics, and has served as the lead analyst on these issues at the Department of Defense. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg is co-chair of the Center for American Security at the American First Policy Institute. Both in and out of uniform, General Kellogg has served at the highest levels of national security leadership for years. Over the past year, Vladimir Putin has inflicted suffering upon innocent civilians, threatened European security, and caused serious consequences for the global economy. Now more than ever, it is clear that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he will not stop there. Russia cannot be allowed to call the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any nation into question. Fortunately, several efforts have thwarted his initial assault. First and foremost is the incredible courage and fighting skill of the Ukrainian people, as well as the inspirational leadership of President Volodymyr Zelensky. I had the opportunity to travel to Kyiv last month and was deeply moved by the Ukrainians' bravery and commitment to defending their homeland. Second is the remarkable statesmanship of the Biden administration in forging a unified response, leading worldwide condemnation of Putin, and providing enormous military, economic, and humanitarian support for Ukraine. Finally, Putin's initial assault has faltered from the inept performance of his own forces. This war has exposed a poorly led and poorly trained Russian army with corrupt leadership at every level, poor tactics and communications, and woeful logistics. This is a critical point in the fight. Ukraine has achieved some very notable successes, but there is hard fighting ahead and more to be done. We and the rest of the international community must continue to support the Ukrainian people and to expedite the assistance that Ukraine needs to be successful. During today's hearing, I would like to hear from our witnesses how these goals can best be achieved. Although NATO is in the midst of the greatest test it has ever faced, if Putin thought his actions over the past year would drive a wedge within the alliance and the international community, he was badly mistaken. NATO has shown remarkable unity and resolve, and a formidable array of our partners around the globe have joined together with incredible speed to provide Ukraine with military, economic, and humanitarian aid, reinforce combat power along NATO's eastern flank, and impose severe costs on Russian decision makers. The carnage and destruction wrought by Putin's invasion cannot be undone, but I am encouraged by Congress's bipartisan action to provide support to Ukraine. The assistance packages approved by Congress and championed by President Biden have made a decisive difference in helping Ukraine repel Putin's troops and mercenaries. These assistance packages are also providing much-needed aid to displaced Ukrainians whose cities and towns continue to face indiscriminate bombardment by Russian forces. Just as the Ukrainians have learned and adapted on the battlefield, the effort to aid and equip their security forces has evolved. Throughout the war, the Biden administration has wisely calibrated our assistance to Ukraine to the conditions on the battlefield. To date, the United States has committed more than $30 billion in security assistance, including 10,000 Javelin and Stinger systems, 160 howitzers, 38 HIMARS, 109 Bradley fighting vehicles, 31 Abrams tanks, 1 million rounds of artillery ammunition, hundreds of air defense systems and UAVs, and hundreds of thousands of other pieces of equipment and ammunition. Remain focused on striking the appropriate balance between providing supplies that can be employed immediately while looking ahead to provide modern weapon systems that will require additional training. At the same time, we cannot lose sight of the most dangerous aspect of this conflict, Russia's escalation strategy. This battle is one of the few times in the atomic age that we have had a surrogate fight with the potential to draw nuclear powers into a confrontation. Russian nuclear threats cannot be dismissed or ignored, but they also cannot be seen as determinative and uncontested. and they must be constantly evaluated as rhetoric or reality. I would ask for our witnesses' assessment of the escalation threat and how we can manage this dynamic moving forward. It is important to remember that this conflict matters not just to Ukrainian sovereignty and security, but also to that of our allies in Europe and indeed our own security here at home. This is not a zero-sum endeavor. Rather, assistance to Ukraine is an investment in U.S. national security, and I look forward to our witnesses' testimonies, and I thank them again for their participation. And with that, let me turn to the ranking member, Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our distinguished panel of witnesses. Last Friday, February 24th, marked a solemn anniversary, 1 year since Russia's unprovoked, illegal, and brutal invasion of Ukraine. The courage and ingenuity shown by Ukrainian troops, many of whom were civilians before the war, continues to be nothing short of heroic. Now, after a long year of bloodshed and sacrifice, the war has entered a crucial phase. Today's hearing is an opportunity to review the current conditions of the war and its possible trajectory, and to discuss policy recommendations to help Ukraine win. I appreciated President Biden's visits to Ukraine and Poland last week. What I do not appreciate is the President's repeated failure to articulate U.S. goals and interests in Ukraine in a fashion that resonates with most Americans. Congress has appropriated over $100 billion of taxpayer funding to assist Ukraine, and more is likely to be needed later this year. So I would welcome our witnesses' views on why supporting Ukraine matters to the average American. In my view, this is not a particularly difficult case to make. U.S. support to Ukraine helps a capable, motivated, and grateful partner nation restore stability to a region of the world that is critical to our interests. As they prevent chaos spreading further into Europe, the Ukrainian armed forces are also significantly degrading the military capability of one of our chief adversaries, Putin's dictatorship. Finally, our support for Ukraine sends a clear message to the Chinese Communist Party that aggression will be met with resolve. Our allies in the Asia-Pacific understand the connection between projecting strength in Ukraine and deterring Chinese aggression. Japan, for example, just announced a $5.5 billion aid package for Ukraine. American interests are being secured without U.S. boots on the ground and for a relatively modest cost. And after a year of fighting, the oversight requirements Congress has put in place seem to be working. Just last week, 3 major independent U.S. watchdogs said they had not received any reports of major fraud regarding U.S. aid. Further, many allies and partners are helping us shoulder the burden. Britain, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and the Baltic states deserve special mention for their contributions. Unfortunately, there are some larger European partners who need to do much more, notably Germany and France. This war matters greatly to the United States, but is being fought in Europe's backyard. I believe some in the Biden administration have recognized that the drip approach to providing military assistance has prevented Ukraine from mounting successful counteroffensives to bring this war closer to an end. And make no mistake, Ukrainian battlefield victories are necessary for a just peace. Vladimir Putin is a war criminal who understands only brute force. He will not negotiate until he's forced to do so. I'd like to hear from our witnesses about what more could be done to sharpen the military capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. We need to learn our lessons from the slow roll approach we've used to arm the Ukrainians thus far. The Ukrainians have continually surprised many in the West with their ingenuity and their will to fight. We are at a pivotal moment in this war, an inflection point we cannot afford to waste as we go about defending the interest of the United States and our allies so that the 21st century is a peaceful, prosperous, and American-led century. I have repeatedly in this past year advocated Ronald Reagan's concept of peace through strength. In addition, Eisenhower said over 70 years ago, only with strength could we achieve the true task of this time to deter aggression and secure peace. So, Mr. Chairman, I do agree with you that we must help our Ukrainian friends, that our help should be expedited, and I do question whether the pace has been properly calibrated. But I thank you, and I look forward to working with you in this mutual bipartisan endeavor, and I thank our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Senator Wicker. And now let me recognize Dr. Stent. Dr. Stent, please.
Thank you very much. Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before your committee at this very critical time. Let me begin with Russia's war aims. What does Vladimir Putin want? When Putin launched his unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine a year ago, his goal was to conquer the country in 3 days, to oust the Zelensky government, and to install a puppet regime loyal to Moscow. Putin does not believe that Ukraine is a separate nation, and he denies that it has the right to exist as a state. In my book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, I have a cynical quote that sums up his view of the world. Putin said, "There are only 4 truly sovereign states in the world: Russia, China, the United States, and India. All the rest have limited sovereignty. They're colonies." Having failed to take Kiev and encountering fierce and effective resistance from the Ukrainians, Russian forces have been pushed back into what is now a brutal war of attrition. In his address to the Federal Assembly last week, Putin claimed that NATO had started the war and was out to destroy Russia, but he said, "We will win on the battlefield." So what exactly are the Russian war aims today? There was no hint in that speech a week ago, save to tell the Russian people that this will be a long war and they have no choice but to support it. At a minimum, Russia wants to get total control of the Donbass region, the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, which have been partially occupied by Russia since 2014. The next goal would be total control of 2 new regions, which he has declared are annexed to Russia, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, an artificial red line. Then Putin might be willing to sit down and negotiate an agreement for a ceasefire. But make no mistake, that would only be temporary. Putin has not given up his goal of conquering Ukraine altogether, and this could be a very long war. As critical for this committee, I believe, at this important time, is European views and the durability of the transatlantic coalition to support Ukraine. Many of you were at the Munich Security Conference last weekend, and you saw and heard the public displays of transatlantic unity, encouragement for Ukraine's determination to prevail. So far, I believe this transatlantic unity has been remarkable. But Europeans are suffering the economic fallout from the sanctions and the end of Russian hydrocarbon imports. Public opinion remains supportive of Ukraine, and a mild winter has mitigated some of the economic pain. But it is likely that as the war drags on this year, there could be more public resistance to sending significant economic support to Ukraine, and more calls to pressure Ukraine to begin to sit down at the negotiating table, if, of course, Russia were willing to sit down and negotiate with Ukraine. Russia will likely step up its information war in Europe this year as elections in various countries loom. The same questioning will likely happen here in the United States as we approach next year's congressional and presidential elections. At Munich, it was clear that Western governments do have to do a better job of explaining to their publics what the stakes are in this war and why it affects their interests. This is about international stability and a world in which rules are observed, rather than the disruptive world Putin wants, one where there are no rules. The same is even more true for the global South, that is, the developing world. And I do have deep concerns about this. As we heard in Munich, these countries face significant problems of food insecurity, the impact of climate change, humanitarian disasters, and this European conflict, in the eyes of many, is absorbing too many resources from the West that would be better directed towards them. The global South has not taken sides in this war and has neither condemned nor sanctioned Russia, meaning that Putin is not isolated. He has been cultivating these countries for years. The United States and our allies need to do a better job of explaining to these countries why it is important that Russia not win this war. Depicting this as a fight between democracy and autocracy is ineffective in many of these countries. It is much more effective to highlight that Russia has violated the United Nations Charter, it's violated international law. If Russia were to prevail and the rest of the world to resume business as usual with Moscow, then no country would be secure in its borders, and no country could count on preserving its territorial integrity. Russia is expecting the developing world to remain neutral. NATO should step up its efforts to counter the Russian narrative, and however difficult it is, the US should try harder to break Putin's information iron curtain and communicate directly with the Russian people and explain what Putin is doing and what this war is really about and its true cost to the Russian people and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stent. Ms. Massacott,
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, members of the committee and
could
staff.
you bring the microphone closer as possible, please?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, members of the committee and staff, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. 1 year has passed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and this grim milestone offers a moment of reflection. My area of expertise is Russian military capabilities, strategy, and operations. My remarks today focused on the past year of war, an assessment of where the war stands at present, and outlines considerations for the future. On the eve of Russia's invasion last year, nearly 200,000 troops amassed on Ukraine's borders. The Ukrainian military and government transitioned to a higher level of readiness and state of emergency only a few weeks prior. Many assumed that if Russia used their advantages wisely, it would be difficult for Ukrainian forces to withstand for long. But the Russians did not prevail. They were instead routed outside many major cities and retreated on multiple occasions. Why? The answer has many components, and no single factor explains the outcomes we see today. Moscow's invasion plan, as we know now, was created by a small secretive group and was riddled with faulty assumptions, arbitrary political guidance, and planning errors. The war plan's design and objectives departed from Russian military strategy and undercut many of its advantages and amplified its structural disadvantages from the outset. The Russian command withheld its war plan from many elements of its invading force until the last minute due to excessive secrecy, leading to multiple preventable errors on their side. These mistakes then collided with fierce Ukrainian resistance and Western weapons, intelligence, training, and planning support. Senior U.S. officials placed Russian casualties at well over 100,000. The damage to the Russian army, airborne, and special forces is systemic and severe, and since last summer has hindered the Russian military's ability to make large territorial gains. The past year of war has come at a high cost to Ukraine, which is now largely dependent on weapons provided by the West. The Russian military has inflicted severe damage on Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure, and its forces stand accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity against Ukrainians. Millions of Ukrainians are internally and externally displaced. However, Russian leaders are preparing for a protracted conflict. To replace lost personnel, Russia mobilized 300,000 men last September. They were hastily trained, and their provisioning is uneven, as are their skill sets. Russia has been withdrawing its older equipment from strategic reserves in Siberia from the war's outset, although that equipment is in various states of serviceability. In January, the Russian military was again ordered to go on the offensive in the Donbass, even though its forces were not prepared. Currently, localized assaults are underway in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts, possibly to bring these regions under full occupation and to keep Ukrainian forces engaged and unable to break away to begin their own counteroffensive. The tactics are crude. The Russians use repetitive armored assaults in some areas, and in others are experimenting with assaults of stormtroops. In many cases, this means human waves with high rates of casualties as they attempt to close on Ukrainian positions. Russian mobilized soldiers now make public appeals to be spared from becoming what they call, quote, cannon meat. The Russian command shows a high tolerance for losses. However rudimentary, the method has brought incremental success in a few areas where Russian shelling occurs around the clock. Some Ukrainian positions, like Bakhmut and areas around Kreminna, are under serious and mounting pressure, and missile strikes by the Russian Air Force continue to chip away at Ukrainian air defenses. I'd like to end my remarks with a brief discussion about what may come next, and the outcome of the war, of course, is highly contingent on multiple factors related to sustainment, force regeneration, and availability of Western support to Ukraine. Russia, for its part, has untapped manpower that numbers in the low millions and will likely need to mobilize replenishment this year. The Kremlin is pressuring its defense industrial base to produce more key munitions, but it has not yet fully activated its wartime authorities. Without mobilizing more men and pulling more equipment from the reserves, another new incursion into northeastern Ukraine, such as the Kharkiv region, would be difficult. And in my opinion, another ground attack on Kyiv seems well beyond the ability of Russian forces now. There are several potentially disruptive events that Russia could undertake that might alter the dynamics of the war that I outline in more detail in my written remarks. So in conclusion, Russian combat potential is diminished due to the losses that it has sustained. It is trying to overcome these deficits by consolidating its positions, generating more manpower and equipment, and using brute force tactics. Defending against this renewed offensive is taking a toll on Ukrainian forces, and Russia is actively digging in with fortifications, trenches, and minefields to make it costly for Ukraine to liberate more of its territory moving forward. The capabilities of both sides are being worn down, and Ukraine will need continued and predictable support as Russia digs deep into its reserves. This concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Kellogg, please.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, esteemed members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I'm grateful to be able to offer my perspective, and I look forward to answering your questions. Among the many opportunities I've had in my life, none has been a greater privilege or a higher honor than wearing the uniform of the United States Army in nearly 4 decades of decorated service on behalf of this country. Much of that was combat service, including 2 tours in Vietnam, Operation Just Cause in Panama, the first Gulf War, and Iraq. I've had the privilege of being the commander of Special Operations Command Europe and the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My military career is one of multiple aspects in my life that make my perspective on the war in Ukraine unique. The second is my service in the last administration on the National Security Council, the acting National Security Advisor to the President, and the National Security Advisor to the Vice President. And finally, a comprehensive 2-week visit I made last month to Ukraine. My trip to Ukraine was facilitated by the expertise of the Weatherman Foundation, founded by Bess Weatherman and Andrew Duncan, seated behind me today, and led by my daughter, West Point graduate Dr. Megan Mobbs. I visited the areas of battle near the line of contact in Kharkiv, Izium, Donetsk, and interfaced across the spectrum of military forces from senior decision makers to trigger pullers. In Bucha and Izium, I saw the firsthand consequences of unbridled Russian aggression and their willingness to kill innocents and use indiscriminate violence against children. My views today, which I offer today in my strictly personal capacity, are consistent with everything I have written and I have said throughout this conflict. To be clear, Russia's full-scale invasion was prefaced by a humiliating American withdrawal and defeat in Afghanistan that allowed Putin to believe he could launch a new war in Europe without a major response, much like he found in 2014 when he seized Crimea from Ukraine. Deterrence has failed, and this failure has been compounded by a willingness to use strong words unaccompanied by decisive and timely action. It is the incremental and halting of the American and allied response to the Russian invasion that persuades Putin he can drag out this war and count on time to be his friend and bring him to victory. It has been support sent in half measures and with hesitation, which succeeds in enabling the fighting of the war, but not the ending of it. This is important because ending the war needs to be the principal American effort. If we do not demonstrate leadership now, we risk being mired in another endless war. As with all wars, there will be negotiation between the warring parties. And so we must look forward to what will hasten those negotiations consistent with American honor and interest. It is clear the path to bringing about these negotiations is to rapidly increase Ukraine's lethality to enable Ukrainian forces to destroy currently committed Russian forces on the battlefield and disrupt their supply chain logistics. Putin must see that the fate of his army in the field in Ukraine is at risk of near total destruction. The reasons for American interest are many. The war threatens the American-led international order. We cannot be secure in our leadership role if we allow a war of regression to progress and persist in a major sovereign state with the potential of a Russian victory. Simply saying, whatever it takes, as long as it takes, is not policy, it's a slogan. One of the great maxims of warfare is, tactics without strategy is just a noise before defeat. No number of supplemental aid packages, no round of sanctions, nor a presidential visit to Kyiv will achieve success without a plan. The Ukraine war must end this year, but not any end will do. An end to the war in Ukraine must be defined with American interests at heart, and there must be a pathway to achieve it. This can be achieved by first providing Ukraine with all the military armament it needs to defeat the Russian army in Ukraine. The survival of Putin's army in the field must be put at risk, and you need to do it now. Second, the identification of an end state for how this war will end, with a roadmap to get there, must be communicated effectively to the American people. And third, our allies must do more, spend more, and do it more quickly. This war is in their backyard, and they cannot expect the citizens of the United States to continue to carry the overwhelming financial burden as they do today. All this is simple, but not easy. Let me be plain. Americans are right to ask the hard questions about why we are spending so much in Ukraine. Many of your own constituents, Americans with whom I've spoken and met, have legitimate concerns about our involvement in this war. We see a federal government that is eager to pour billions into the defense of Ukrainian borders while showing no real interest in the defense of American borders. From a strictly policy perspective, the correct answer is that American government is equipped to do both. As we enter the second year in Ukraine, we cannot continue the status quo. We need to work towards an end to this war and do so immediately and decisively. If this war turns into a multiple year of attrition, which is its present trajectory, then Americans may be asked to sacrifice more than they are willing to give, and Ukraine will lose. As it stands, the Ukrainian defeat is an American defeat by proxy. This cannot be tolerated. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, General. Dr. Stent, one of the issues that continually engages the planners and the statesmen and women who deal with this problem is escalation. Could you comment upon the factors that you see, particularly since so much of this is really a function of what Putin is thinking, and that's an odd analysis one must make?
Well, thank you, Chairman. That is obviously a key question. I think Putin, from the beginning, has wanted us to believe that he could escalate. He wants to intimidate not only the Ukrainians, but really the Western coalition, the NATO countries that are supporting Ukraine. And therefore, we've had these hints from him right from the beginning. You know, we are a very strong nuclear power. We can do things that you haven't even dreamed of. And that waxes and wanes. Sometimes it's more forceful. Sometimes he stops saying that. We have had at some point the Chinese even saying that it's, you know, criticizing the use of this kind of rhetoric, not criticizing him, the Indians too. So there's been some pushback there. But he wants us to believe that he could do this. And I think, you know, you cannot rule out, if we're talking about the potential use of a tactical nuclear weapon, right? You cannot rule out that he would never do it because he does have the weapons. But I think we have allowed ourselves sometimes to limit what we're doing for Ukraine because we are too concerned about the potential for, you know, World War III breaking out. Again, I don't want to dismiss it and say it couldn't happen, but I think we have to be very careful in looking at this. There are many unknowns, but not allowing us to limit what we're doing because of this changing rhetoric that we hear from Vladimir Putin.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Massicot, the Russians went in with a plan that collapsed. Their forces had multiple difficulties. What do you think they've learned which they can usefully apply in the next several months?
I think they realized within about a month and a half that they had too many objectives for the forces they had left. So you saw them withdraw from Kyiv, you saw them then withdraw from northeastern Ukraine, and really this has been a process that has been ongoing up until the recent withdrawal from Kherson. They are capable of adapting their tactics. There is some institutional learning going on in that regard. They're more effective now with their electronic warfare. They're more effective with some of their air defenses. It's hurting Ukraine's ability to fly drones that were very effective in the beginning. In terms of the larger issues that they are facing, they have shown an unwillingness or inability to target or interdict Western support coming into Ukraine. I think that's an escalation choice on their part. They don't want to open that up. They can't overcome that with that mentality, and I don't think they want to at this time. So tactically, yes, they can adapt. There's no secret new Russian army that's going to come from east of the Urals and finish this. They're very damaged at this point.
Thank you. General Kellogg, one of the strengths, I think, of the Ukrainian forces is the training that we began in 2014 under President Obama for their young non-commissioned officers and their younger officers who today, as the clock ticks forward, are now senior NCOs and battalion officers. Is that your impression also?
Yes, Senator, it is. Their quality of leadership is much better than the Russian quality of leadership. The Russians have not learned the Western-style leadership. We transferred our expertise with the young non-commissioned officers, which the Russians do not rely on, our younger officers and our senior officers as well. And I think the other thing they've done is the fact is the Russians violated every principle of war I ever grew up with in the start of this invasion, and the Ukrainians were able to capitalize on it. You cannot discount the valor of the Ukrainian soldiers either. There's one thing that Napoleon once said, the moral to the physical is 3:1. Never discount the heart of a fighting army and the training they've received.
I've witnessed that in my brief stay in Ukraine, where their forces are committed to the fight, unlike, I think, most of the Russian conscripts who are essentially, as it was described, they're trying to avoid what the meat grinder, whatever. So I think that's an advantage. And I think also, too, what is consistent in all your testimony is the need to explain to the world what's at stake and to continue to provide support for the Ukrainian people. One other aspect of this is the overall effort, and sometimes we merely look at the military aspect, but there's a significant amount of humanitarian assistance, indeed direct budgetary assistance to the government of Ukraine, and some of our allies are doing much more of that than they are with military assistance, but you need the combination of humanitarian, governmental, and military assistance to carry the day. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. General Kellogg, you are dissatisfied with the pace of delivery of weaponry and ammunition. Dr. Stent mentioned in her testimony that we're limiting what we do for various reasons. One of the arguments that is sort of baffling is that we're holding back on some things because we need them to defend our interests in NATO. That's surprising to me, since we are in NATO and we have positioned our resources there to defend against Russia. So does it make sense to hold back our capabilities in other places in Europe rather than deliver them where the fight is right now?
No, Senator, it does not. Senator, the Ukrainians are fighting the fight that we thought we were going to fight 20 and 25 years ago against the very people we thought we were going to fight with the very equipment that we thought we were going to have to use in Europe. So give the Ukrainians the equipment they need. An example, Army Preposition Set number 2 is sitting in Germany. Multiple combat teams, multiple brigade sets are sitting right there. Transfer that equipment now. It's there. They can train for it in Grafenwehr and Hohenfels, unleash it against the Russians. That's what the equipment was designed to be used for. You might as well use the equipment it was designed for. And the Russians, once they have an inability to proceed on the battlefield, they have no ability to go towards NATO because they will not have the military capacity as long as we use the equipment that we should be giving them right now.
And how soon could that be accomplished?
Sir, it could be rapidly. The equipment's stationed right there. You can get the prepossession sets moving as quickly as you want to. They'll be saying, well, it's going to affect our readiness. No, it doesn't, because the readiness was designed to be used for was to defeat the Russian army. That's what the Ukrainians are doing right now.
Exactly.
Give them the tools they need to win this fight now.
Well, if you would comment on the practicality of F-16s, do you buy the administration's stated reason for the reluctance there and the attacks?
My concern on that, Senator, is the fact that when they need them, when the term was when they don't need them right now, well, when they do need them, it'll be late to give it to them. What they really need are the MiG-29s that came out of Poland. Give them the equipment they're used to be using on there. Now, it's not as, the avionics clearly not as good on U.S. aircraft as we see on, like, example, the MiG-29. But they can still put equipment on there that can defeat the Russians. You can put the Harm 88 missile on it. You can put a lot of ordnance on that. Give them the stuff that they're currently used to using in the air.
Okay, well, is there any point in our training beginning to train the Ukrainian pilots on F-16s at this point? Do you recommend that or not?
Senator, I would be training them on everything we've got, because if we had an ability to bring them back, we should have done it months ago. It still takes time to train, regardless if it's a tank crewman or a pilot in an aircraft. We probably should be training them if we had an ability. If we thought that we were going to come to it, get ahead of the game instead of behind the game.
And then there are two schools of thought with regard to the Pacific. One is that this distracts us from our major threat, and that's the Communist Party of China. The other is that China is watching and looking for indications of American resolve. So why should we be, how should we be viewing this with regard to the pacing threat of China?
Well, two parts real quickly. The actions we were taking in Ukraine, supporting them, is being watched by China. And if they see us with strength, they will regard us with caution as well. And I'm not sure we're doing that. Sir, and the first question again was on the two fight. Sir, I believe that the fight in the Pacific, if we have to go there, will be primarily an air and naval fight. It won't be a ground fight. We're not going to march to Beijing. So the systems are different. It's a ground war in Europe. It's an air and sea war primarily in the Pacific, sort of like an apples and oranges.
And I hear two concerns among the talking heads now. One is corruption and our resources potentially being stolen over there. Am I correct that we're pretty much on top of that? And also, is it fair to count the burden sharing as Ms. Masico, I believe, indicated in terms of the humanitarian aid that is being primarily shouldered by our European allies?
Well, we're still giving, according to the Kiel Institute, sir, which tracks that, still 50% of the aid out of the countries they track, 41, is still 50% American. So we're giving a lot. They need to step up to the plate and do more to be able to give that aid to them as well. And again, sir, the first question was on the comment, sir. The first one, part of that.
You know, I shouldn't ask two questions at one time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Shaheen, please.
Thank you, and thank you to each of you for being here this morning. Dr. Stent, you pointed out that Russia is going to step up its information war this year. I think they've been very effective in their information war, actually much more so than we have, and I wonder if you and others on the panel have thoughts about what we should be doing to ramp up our information war to combat what Russia's doing, not just in Europe, but Africa and other places around the world.
Thank you, Senator. I mean, we definitely should be, and I think we have not done as good a job as we should. We know what the Russians are doing. It's very difficult to counter some of their disinformation, but we have a lot of smart people working on this who should understand how to do it. We have to do for different audiences. So I think we have to also, you know, explain to the Europeans, those people who oppose supporting Ukraine, what this is about. We definitely have to do more in the global South, whether that is radio, TV, using other media, really explaining to them what this conflict is about. And as I said, I think we also have to try and penetrate that iron information curtain in Russia itself. We are not getting through to the Russian people. It's very difficult to. They don't have alternative sources of information, and even when they do, they don't know what to believe. But I just think we should put more resources into that.
Thank you, I agree. Before I go on, I want to ask you about Belarus, because Lukashenko a couple of weeks ago announced that Belarus would not join Putin's war, although it continues to serve as a staging area. So can you talk about how much you think we can rely on that? Are we going to see Belarus engage further with Putin in this war? And what's the status of the citizens of the country in terms of their concern about the war?
Sure, that's a very important question. So Russia has been pressuring Belarus since the beginning to send troops there. But one thing that the dictator Lukashenko understands is that 80% of the Belarusian population do not support this war, and if he did try and mobilize and send them there, he would face significant disruptions and protests at home. Yes, it's a very repressive state, but still, people do take to the streets there. So he does understand that, and that's why he said we'll only join the war if Belarus is attacked by Ukraine. Now, of course, you could manufacture something, which they would be capable of doing, and say, well, the Ukrainians threatened us. But so far, he has held that line. And in fact, there are Belarusians who are fighting with the Ukrainians in Ukraine. If you look at the recent meeting between President Putin and President Lukashenko, and just look at President Putin's body language, these are not two leaders who are too fond of each other, and the Russians have been irritated by Lukashenko for a long time. On the other hand, he's completely dependent on them now to stay in power because of the fraudulent election. So I think I would not anticipate that Lukashenko will send troops there unless something drastically changes and he's told that he has no choice, but he will face real opposition domestically.
Thank you. Ms. Mascott, what would be the impact of China providing weapons to Russia?
I think Russia has a few immediate needs that China could fill. I'm not a China expert, and I certainly don't understand whether or not they will do this or not, but Russia has shell hunger. They need artillery rounds now. China could fill that for them temporarily until their defense industrial base clicks into a higher gear, which is in progress now. It may take them multiple months or the end of the year for their own domestic resumption. I think also Chinese ISR would help Russia try to close some of the gap with the Ukrainians, although the Ukrainians are outclassing them in this regard, either organically or through the support that we're providing them. Really, those two things are immediate. The higher-end capabilities, and this is very speculative, there are multiple shared systems between the two militaries. So it could be air defense missiles. They run on the shared systems. Russia has been repurposing those for land attack munitions. I think that's probably a very low probability, but I would be looking at artillery. I'd be looking at drones.
Well, hopefully they will decide that it's not in their interest to do that. Can I ask you about the Wagner Group and the dynamic between the Wagner Group and the Russian army, and whether there's any reason to think that's going to deteriorate, or have they reached peace and are able to work together?
I think it's deteriorating in real time this week. Those two groups have had tensions that date back to Syria, and it bubbles up and then it's resolved. The thing about President Putin is he doesn't like mess. And right now this is very messy and uncontrolled. So I think inevitably he will probably step in and resolve this. Wagner, over time, is becoming less important to the overall war effort. As Russia mobilizes and has more men, that critical role that they played last summer will decline over time. Prigozhin is misreading a lot of really important cues right now. He's being told by important and dangerous people to stop with the public criticism, and he persists. I think also they're taking a long-term approach to undercut him. He's not allowed to recruit from the prisons anymore, and they're choking back some of his artillery supplies this week near Bakhmut. So I think that this is deteriorating in real time. I don't think his future is a bright one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cheney. Senator Ernst, please.
Thank you very much for being here for our panelists this morning. I had the great opportunity this past weekend to spend time in Poland Saturday and Sunday with our Iowa Army National Guard troops. So we do have a couple of units that were mobilized for regularly scheduled deployments. We have the 209th Medical Company as well as the 1133rd Transportation Company. And I just want to say to all of our folks back home, their families and loved ones, that I am so very proud of these hard-charging young men and women from Iowa. They are doing an incredible job supporting in Poland. God bless them all. So, Dr. Stent, I know you had a very powerful message for all of us talking about the message we need to send not only to the world, but to Americans as well, and how we should be speaking to that. Can you just double down on that for me, please, and how we should be talking to the American people about this? Because as General Kellogg pointed out, it's important that Americans understand, because they do have valid concerns, but they need to understand the gravity of the war in Ukraine. So what, again, is that message, and how do we communicate that?
Thank you, Senator. You know, we have to explain to the American people, first of all, in the last century, twice the U.S. had to intervene in a war in Europe to essentially save Europe and save the world from tyranny and from conquest. And so what's happening between Russia and Ukraine? Russia, you know, after 77 years after the end of World War II, just broke the system that we had. It violated all of the sort of rules that governed the world after the end of World War II. And by just invading a neighbor really on a whim, with no provocation, it was saying that, you know, it could arbitrarily take over another country. It didn't respect its territorial integrity, its sovereignty. And so if Russia is allowed to continue, if Russia were to prevail in this war, this wouldn't be the end of it. It would want to take the whole of Ukraine. It set its sights on other countries. It's already undermining Moldova, for instance. And really, it's also explicitly said that it believes that Poland is still in its sphere of influence. If you look at the two so-called treaties that were presented to the United States and NATO in December of 2021. So it is a question of in a world order. That sounds very abstract, but it's a world in which Russia would like a world where there are no rules. It's a disruptive power. It could cause instability, you know, on the European continent, certainly for a long time. That has huge economic impacts. And as we've seen, even global impacts in the way that it's prevented the Ukrainians from exporting much of their grain and fertilizers. So I think the American people have to understand it does affect them. And that if Russia isn't stopped, we can't sort of wall ourselves off from this conflict. And we need to, you know, reestablish rules that people will abide by and respect international law.
Yes.
So I think that's probably the best way of explaining it.
No, I really appreciate it. And I don't think Americans want to live in a world that's dominated by Russia and by China. I think it's very important that Ukrainians win this war. Ms. Manicott, when we talk about equipment and the degradation of Russian capabilities, Ukrainian capabilities, is Ukraine sufficiently equipped to suppress and defeat Russia's air defenses? And what are those weapon systems that the U.S. could maybe provide to effectively counter the Russian air defenses?
That's one of the most complicated missions to do. I don't think the Ukrainians would be able to do it comprehensively from the air. Russia's SAM system is really quite multi-layered at this point in Ukraine. And Russia and Ukraine are both denying each other the use of airspace right now. On the ground capabilities that could potentially disable some of these systems, the Ukrainians have been able to target them with precision munitions. So that is if they are provided the right type of information, they act on it pretty quickly. So that is really helping that degradation over time. From an air-to-ground perspective, I think that would be pretty difficult.
Mm-hmm. So and just in closing, because my time is running out, I do believe in supporting Ukraine. I think it's important that we continue to do this and do it full on, not the drip, drip, drip we've seen from the administration. And I really appreciate all of you being here today and sharing your message with all of our folks back home as well. But again, to the folks that love and support the 209th and the 1133rd, God bless them. They're doing well. You should be proud of them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Senator Gillibrand, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stent and Ms. Masico Public reporting shows that the Chinese government is considering providing lethal support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How does a hollowed-out Russian army affect China's security posture? And what opportunities does the PRC government see in providing lethal support to Russia?
Maybe I'll start with part of it. Thank you, Senator. I think we have to understand that the Chinese do not want Russia to lose this war. You know, Xi Jinping and Putin say extravagant things about each other. They're each other's best friends. But when it comes down to the bottom line, from the Chinese point of view, Russia is the other major authoritarian country in the world that shares their grievances against the West. Both of them talk about a post-West order. In other words, they need Russia as a partner in trying to change the way that the world works and make it more safe, really, for autocracy. And they may be very surprised and maybe even appalled by the performance of the Russian military. But now that it looks that, you know, Russia is really quite bogged down, they do not want Russia to lose this war, because their concern is, and it's very hard for us to imagine that, but if somebody were to come after Vladimir Putin, who would rethink what Russia is doing, rethink its ties, its antagonistic ties to the West, rethink its aggressive policies, and rethink its dependence on China, then from the Chinese point of view, that would leave them alone. Again, hard for us to understand. So I think that even though until now the Chinese have been fairly restrained in what they've done materially for Russia, even though they support rhetorically everything that's the Russian narrative, they certainly would not want to see Russia lose. And you know, it remains to be seen whether they're willing to take the risk of supplying, as we hear, possibly artillery and drones.
I don't have much to add to that, other than, again, they might be able to provide a short-term stopgap for the Russians and provide some type of, you know, artillery rounds or drones. But I agree with Dr. Stent.
Dr. Stent, have the events in the past year led you to revise any conclusions you made in your 2019 book, Putin's World? What are the biggest changes?
So last week, an updated version of the book came out with a chapter on the Russia-Ukraine war. So obviously, in that book, I certainly understood the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, but I think I, like many people, didn't believe that Putin would undertake a full-scale invasion of Ukraine the way he did. So I think what it's led me to rethink is I had always viewed Putin as someone who was a pretty smart tactician and not a huge risk taker. So in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, it didn't go to the capital, Tbilisi, and take out President Saakashvili, whom, of course, President Putin hated. It stopped and just recognized these two areas of Georgia as being independent. And even in 2014, it took over Crimea fairly bloodlessly, and it didn't continue prosecuting the war in the Donbass. It started the war. And so I think what's changed is the amount of risk that Putin is willing to take. He was obviously woefully misinformed about the performance of his own military and about the performance of the Ukrainian military. And so I think we see someone who is so hell-bent on reestablishing what he thinks is Russia's rightful empire that he's not listening to, I think, the counsel of anyone else. So I think it's the willingness to take risks and to just dig himself in, and which I think has made me somewhat change my evaluation of him.
Do you have anything to, with regard to the General Assembly, they voted overwhelmingly last week to condemn Russia's invasion, but there were 32 abstentions. Russia has been aggressively spreading misinformation, not just in Russia and the homeland, but also in Africa and Latin America regarding the causes of the war, who's at fault for grain and fertilizer shortages and similar topics. How can the United States and their allies counter these Russian diplomatic efforts, both for Dr. Stent and
So I think we do have to be more active diplomatically. I mean, we already discussed sort of information war, but we do have to be more active. I mean, Russia, even during this first year of the war, has increased its influence in Africa, partly through the Wagner Group, but also partly through diplomacy. We just had Sergei Lavrov in South Africa recently, and you've just had this past week a joint naval exercise between Russia, China, and South Africa. So I think we do have to step up our diplomatic efforts in Latin America, in Africa, and in the Middle East to try and counter some of what Russia is doing.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. Lieutenant General, thank you for your service. I'd like to say this first. I was in Ukraine 6 months before this war started and talked to President Zelensky. They knew this was coming. They were putting troops on the border through Belarus, all through the Don, all over the place, building it up, knowing it was coming. We didn't do one thing. We said it was going to be a small incursion. That's what President Biden said. We're coming off Afghanistan. We didn't look very smart. What would we do different, General, now, in your eyes? Now we're doing it. We're waiting. It seems like we're one step behind in everything we're doing. What should we have done different at the beginning? Because it looks like we're going to be the defender of the free world. We need to learn from our mistakes, and we made huge mistakes at the beginning of this.
Yes, Senator, thanks for your question. As a former and retired military officer, I'm a little bit disappointed in the military and the intelligence community that either didn't relay this or didn't believe it as well. You know, recall, we had very senior officers say, one, that Ukraine would fall within 3 days of the invasion and tried to get President Zelensky a ride out of town. And that's when he made the comment, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. You know, you can have a beer with that kind of guy. You know, the fact is we just didn't really believe it and we didn't look at it hard. I would really question our intelligence communities, all of them, and also the military, why their decision-making was so poor in foreseeing this. Most of us saw it. We saw the indicators. I'm a big believer in indicators and patterns, and the patterns and indicators were there. So I think it was a fault somewhere in our systems that we didn't convince ourselves that it was really going to happen. Part of it may have been a misunderstanding of President Putin himself, and they just didn't believe he would do it. I've actually heard commentators say, up until the day before the invasion, he wasn't going to do it. Yes, he was. And if you read Putin, and I had a fortune, when I was in the National Security Council, I brought Dr. Fiona Hill in on the NSC team. She came out of Brookings, and she's a very well-read person on Putin. And she says, when he says something, believe it. He's going to do it. Well, we didn't believe it.
Yeah, thank you. And now we're up to our ears and alligators. China looks like China's getting ready. And just a couple of yes/no questions for Dr. Stanton and General Kellogg. You know, let's talk about China's motivation. Do you think that Chinese weapons are going to further drag out this conflict? Dr. Stanton, yes or no?
Yes.
General?
No.
Do you think we need to increase weapons supplies to Ukraine to counter Chinese munitions? Dr. Stanton, since you said yes?
Yes.
Okay. If we're increasing our support to Ukraine, do you believe that that will slow down shipments to Taiwan in the future if we continue to send munitions to Ukraine? You don't think it will?
No.
All right, Ms. Mascott, at a hearing on February the 15th, this committee heard expert testimony that if the United States were to enter a war with China today, we would have just 2 weeks' worth of munitions. Our stockpiles would be out. Do you agree with this assessment?
I don't have enough information to make an assessment, I'm sorry.
Take a shot at it, General.
I do not agree with that assessment at all.
Okay, thank you. General Kellogg, do you have a clear sense of the overall U.S. strategy in Ukraine, and what does victory look like for Ukraine?
I do not have an overall view of what the current strategy in Ukraine is. I believe we should have one, and I think you have to put, end state, you have to put Russia's army at risk in Ukraine. Putin has to understand he's got two options, lose his army or leave. If his army loses and is defeated, he falls.
Can Ukrainians win it on their own?
No. Let me phrase it. They can win it on their own if we give them the equipment to do it.
Yeah. Okay. What's the most dangerous course of action for the United States when it comes to this conflict? What puts us in harm's way?
By doing what we're doing right now, because it is not disciplined. It is also not emphatic.
Okay. There was a poll out. You know, the Russian people believe, from a poll in Russia, that they're at war right now with the United States. The Russian people believe this. Do you think the American people think we're at war with Russia, General?
No, I do not, and that is because of the messaging.
Yeah. Dr. Stent?
No, I don't think so.
How concerned, General, you concerned about nuclear conflict? How concerned?
I think it has to be a consideration simply because it's in the Russian philosophy to use. They've got a large amount of what and I hate to use the term tactical nuclear weapons, and they believe in using it. And it's something we really don't have. And if it's in their philosophy to use it, if it gets pushed, he may use it. I'm hoping that there'll be smarter people would not use it, but you always have to understand the probability and possibility of it happening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tocqueville. Senator Manchin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you all for your service, all of you. I appreciate it very much. First of all, I want to say that I'm old enough to remember vividly the Vietnam War and all the conflicts we've had since then. And I believe this is the most just position the United States has ever taken for the right cause, to be involved for the sake of freedom and democracy, and what I think we all should be doing. So I'm very supportive and very appreciative of our efforts, and all of them, but also we can do much better. I always think that too. I would ask the question to any of you all can answer on these here. Do the Ukrainians have the ability to produce weapons themselves? Are they manufacturing? Do you all know if there's any manufacturing in Ukraine right now? Ms. Mascott.
Thank you, Senator. The Russians, from the beginning of the war, systematically attacked Ukraine's defense industrial base. So a lot of those factories
That's since 2014?
Since what they could range back then, but especially since 22. I mean, that's part of their strategy that they actually did implement. They went after those factories, so either the workers are mobilized, or they're fighting, or the facilities are damaged. So no, at this point—
They're not producing anything. They're depending totally, and there's a reason for that then, what you're
right,
saying.
there's a structural reason for that, yes.
Okay. And in Crimea right now, you know, I saw this morning, there was a report on television that's showing that most Crimeans are Russian, believe that they are part of Russia and want to remain part of Russia. But I understand that Zelensky and Ukrainians want that to be part of their country, because it is. So where do we go with that? How do you, and Miss Dr. Stanton, maybe you can talk to this, or any of y'all can answer it. Is it possible that Crimea would come back and be part of Ukraine, or would it remain separate?
President Zelensky has said that it is we do know what Ukraine's at least official war aims are, and it is their aim to take back Crimea, which of course the Russians illegally annexed in 2014. There are some people who believe that if the Ukrainians try to take back Crimea, if we come back to the question of escalation now, that would be a quote-unquote red line for Putin, and that might lead to a real military escalation. I think it's unlikely in this present phase of the war that the Ukrainians would be able to take back Crimea. Maybe they will in the longer term, depending on what happens in Russia, how
No, the bridge has been repaired. I saw the bridge is back in operation.
The bridge is back in operation. I don't know what you think they are.
Anybody else on that?
Senator, you know, Zelensky made the comment the war began in Crimea in 2014. It will end in Crimea. And I think he has to take that into consideration. I do think the Ukrainians with support can, in fact, penetrate towards Kherson, towards Crimea, and put it at risk. But that would be something for negotiations somewhere along the line. Wars end by negotiations, and that would just be part of it.
My only concern is basically it seems like the Crimean people there are sympathetic and feel more connected to Russia than they do Crimea, from what we're hearing in type of reports. And without the citizen support, like they have the rest of Ukraine, it's be quite difficult, I would think. The biggest thing I'm concerned about is accountability. I think our support is unwavering. It's bipartisan, Democrat and Republican, overwhelmingly supporting the United States effort in supporting Ukraine. I'm concerned about the accountability. Are we basically good, from Inspector General, a good accounting on the equipment we're sending, the money that we're sending, vice versa? Because if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, that whole country, I mean, just was reeked with corruption. And I think it showed how quickly they fell as soon as we left. And I also believe that we left the wrong way. And I think that gave Putin much more stimulus to do what he's done. You have any comments on that, General?
Yeah, I think we're getting better, Senator, on accountability. We're not there yet. When we were in Ukraine recently, they do not object to accountability. I would provide a special inspector general or something like that, or provide on the team to ensure accountability to the American people and make sure that their money is being well spent out there. But are there problems? Of course there are, but they're getting better at it and they're trying to fix it.
And General, the last move that I think Zelensky's just removed one of his top officers, a top military person, and replaced him. What do you read into that, any of you?
Well, he's not only replaced military officers, he's also replaced several other people in his office because of corruption concerns out there. On the other side, remember the Russians are on their 5th general and that are running this
No,
war.
I know that, but I'm saying, do you think it's a smart move? Dr. Stent, do you have any comments on that?
I think President Zelensky understands that if the European Union is really ever to accept Ukraine, it has to do a much better job of dealing with corruption. So I think some of the sackings that we've seen in the past few weeks, both of military personnel, but then other personnel, it's all connected to that. And hopefully, he'll make progress with it.
Again, thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Senator Mullen, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. I've got a couple of comments and some questions too. Last week, I was on a trip to the Middle East, meeting with the leaders over there. And General, you're absolutely right. Afghanistan the withdrawal was a very strong negative black eye to the United States. It has made us extremely weak, and our allies. Those that believe that we would be there are questioning if we would actually be there, if we were willing to walk away from something we had so much investment in and literally turn the country over to terrorists. The irony of that, though, is President Trump, obviously, when he was in office, he put in the Abraham Accord. And the Abraham Accord was designed to help strengthen the economy in that region, but it's actually strengthened the allies in that region, too, by doing business together. With Israel, the views that some of these world leaders have had with Israel has been broken, and they've realized that they have a common foe, and it has strengthened themselves. And so what has started out as an opportunity for business has actually helped fill a void that the United States have left behind. With that being said, it has definitely led to Putin's aggression because of our view. And at the same time, the American people are questioning why we're even in Ukraine and what we're doing there. I feel very strong that we need to be there, but I don't feel as though we should be taking the lead. I feel like it is what our NATO allies are for. That is what we have alliances for, and I feel like that we need to be working with them, not necessarily leading. But it's obvious, too, with Germany, for instance, wavering back and forth on should they send weapons or shouldn't they send weapons, when the United States decided that we were going to send Abrams tanks. No telling when that's actually going to happen, though. You had Germany that finally agreed to start sending in weapons. General, what is your view of our leadership and the lack of leadership? How is this affecting what's happening and the neighbors of Ukraine and their activity going on and assisting Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator. Senator, I'm concerned about the decisiveness of support for Ukraine. I mean, this is a fight. It's an existential fight for Ukraine, and we need to support it. If we don't support this fight, we're going to be in the third time we're going to be fighting in Europe. And we are not sending U.S. troops right now, and I don't think we should. And no Ukrainians thought we should either. Every Ukrainian commander and every civilian and military leader, they do not want American troops on the ground. They want the equipment. They're able to fight it. But if this thing goes badly for the Ukrainians and it starts to fade towards NATO, then we may get involved in a fight that I would prefer we not do, considering we've done this twice before to save Europe.
Should NATO shut down the airspace?
In airspace in when? Over
Ukraine?
Sure, the Russians do not have air dominance over Ukraine right now. The fact is the Ukrainians are still fighting with their fighters. They have not established air dominance at all. What you are seeing is the missiles coming in, but they're not able to fly their aircraft over Ukraine.
Would it help if we were able to shut down, if NATO were to just simply shut down the airspace over Ukraine?
You know, Senator, I think I don't think the airspace would concern me very much right now because it's really contested, and the Ukrainians are doing a fine job. I think there's other things we should do. The other thing that we should do is we should give them the ability to actually penetrate Russian space themselves and attack targets into Russia, because that's where the supply lines are located. And the Russians are using their borders as a sanctuary. So it's not so much airspace. I go back to ground space and been able to put the Russians at risk. We haven't put meaning the Ukrainians, have not been able to put the Russians at risk as they should be able to do.
Does Putin have the ability himself to launch nuclear weapons, or does it go through a process? I know it used to go through a process. Is that faded now? Is the lines blurred?
Sure, they do have a process, and I don't want to get into there because then I'll fall back on what I did at National Security Council.
Sure.
But they have a process. I'm just hoping that if we ever get to a position like that, wiser heads would prevail.
Well, I'm familiar with the process. Before I was in the Senate, I was on the House Intel, and we were very aware of it, but I was concerned that it may be blurred now. One last comment I'll make, and I'll make it brief. The IC community, at least the ones in the field, and I'm not trying to defend the IC community here in Washington, D.C. I think they're riddled with problems, but they did call it right, and they were advising us that this was imminent, that they were going, and they were very precise on even the time frame of when it was going to happen. Unfortunately, when we were meeting with the decision makers, they weren't very positive on Ukraine's resolve, and that's where we misread it. We should understand that Ukraine was going to fight, and I will admit I even got that wrong. Now that they're fighting, we should do everything we can to support them and with our allies. So thank you guys, everybody, for your comments. And thanks for talking. It's honestly in agreement with one voice. It's refreshing. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mullen. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll pick up with Senator Mullen left off. I think while you come at this from different perspectives and have some differences in your testimonies, I'm picking up a common punchline, which is we're doing a lot, but we need to do more, and we need to do it quicker. We have to calculate and calibrate, but we should do more and do it quicker. Our allies, they're doing a lot, but they should do a lot more and invest a lot more because they have more at stake. General Kellogg, you talked about this war in their backyard, and I think that that's true. So I think that that is coming through loud and clear. I do want to just comment on one thing. General Kellogg, in your testimony, you said this, simply saying that one will support Ukraine for as long as it takes is a bumper sticker, not a strategy. No number of supplemental aid packages, no rounds of sanctions, and not even a presidential visit to Kyiv are substitutes for American leadership. Let me just offer my thoughts on that. The sanctions packages that the United States have engineered, they ain't a bumper sticker. They ain't a bumper sticker. They're an example of great American diplomacy. The billions of dollars of aid that this Congress has appropriated for military purposes in Ukraine with the president's request, that ain't a bumper sticker. That's American leadership. It wasn't Estonia that did it. It wasn't Liechtenstein that did it. The billions in dollars of aid for humanitarian purposes that we've allocated, not a bumper sticker. That's American leadership. 100,000 Ukrainian refugees into the United States in the 5 months after the invasion. Don't look at the Armed Services Committee and tell me that that's a bumper sticker. That's American leadership. Engineering a state of affairs where Finland and Sweden, whose popular approval for accession to NATO would have been about 25% a couple of years ago, are now on the verge of joining NATO and dramatically increasing both the NATO and Western defense capacity. Don't tell me that's a bumper sticker. That's American leadership. Engineering overwhelming votes in the General Assembly and the National Security Council to call out Putin's illegal war effort. Admittedly, there are nations that abstain, there are nations that stand with Russians that are acknowledging the facts. That ain't a bumper sticker. That's American leadership. I don't see any reason why anybody should be Debbie Downer about American leadership that has assembled a global coalition to stand for Ukraine. We're not trashing Zelensky anymore. We're standing up with him. We're not undermining Ukraine anymore. We're standing up for Ukraine. And if you wonder about American leadership, talk to President Zelensky, because we all do. We talk to him in person. I have colleagues who visit him in Ukraine. He came and addressed us right before Christmas. I had no reason to believe he was lying to us when he thanked us for American leadership. The global effort to stand for Ukraine against an illegal invasion by a dictator that is not only necessary in all of our view to stand up against Putin, but also to send a message to dictators around the globe, would not have happened without American leadership. By this committee, by the Appropriations Committee, by the Intel Committee, by the Foreign Relations Committee, by the administration.
Thank you.
Could we do more? Could we do it quicker? Could we look in the rearview mirror and say things might have been done? Of course. Should we exercise oversight on the investments that we make in Congress? Should we be able to answer questions the American public asks us about the stakes or about the dollars we're investing? Of course we should. Those are all really important questions and they're very fair. But to suggest that the coordinated effort of the Article 1 and 2 branches in outreach around the world to assemble a global coalition to support Ukraine is a bumper sticker rather than American leadership, I don't get it. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists that are here today. I'd like to begin by asking you to share your assessments on the current status of war in Ukraine. So, and hopefully I'm going to be like Senator Tupperville and we'll do yes or no unless you feel a driving desire that you have to explain further. We'll start with you, Doctor. How would you assess the current state of the Russian military in Ukraine? Well, they're struggling to perform better. On the other hand, they do have, a few 100,000 more people that they can throw into this war, and they've learned a little bit from their mistakes, but still, they're struggling. Thank you. Ms. Masika.
I don't think they've culminated in a Clausewitzian sense, but their combat effectiveness is definitely degraded. They're trying to find a solution, and I think that they're trying to use brute force tactics to close on the Ukrainians as quickly as possible at a very high cost. I don't think they're capable of large incursions anymore, not for several years until they can properly regenerate armored force and rebuild their missile stocks. That being said, I do anticipate incremental gains in Donetsk and Luhansk, potentially a little bit more in Zaporizhia. I don't have a timeline on that, but probably towards the summer, that's what their intentions are.
When you talk about the Russians using brute force,
yes,
brutal tactics, will the Ukrainians suffer through that and remain strong?
Their will to fight is very strong, but this is taking a toll on them. That is not only a high casualty situation for them as well, there's also a lot of psychological distress because, again, we're talking about mowing down human waves every day. Also, they have specific needs that are emerging from this type of fighting, and we're talking about ammunition, small arms, 50 caliber, mortars, artillery shells to counter this. So, I know we talk a lot about ATACMS and F-16s, but I would just like to point out that they have immediate small arms needs to include morphine.
Thank you. In general?
Senator, thank you. I think you're heading to a war of attrition like we're seeing around Bakhmut right now. The longer this war goes, it accrues to Russia's favor. That's the reason it must be terminated as quickly as it can while Ukraine still has the advantage. Russia will have the advantage. Russia is learning right now, as we're seeing around Bakhmut, where they're changing how they fight, the tactics they are using by sheer mass and heavy use of artillery. They're going back to the way the Russians used to fight before.
General, how important is it that the United States and our allies continue to be supportive to Ukraine for their psychological reasons and to show the Russians that that we will be supportive to the Ukrainians? How does that play into your previous analysis that you just stated?
Well, I think the Ukrainians can do more. If you look what the Kiel Institute just said, and that's out of Kiel, Germany, the European Union has only committed 6% of their total stores of military stock, where the British have committed 25% of their total stock, and we're committing a lot of our stock as well. So I think when it comes down to, and referring back to Senator Kane said a minute ago, is there isn't a question about presidential leadership, not what this Congress has done, which has been enormous, but where you lead is from the top, and where those decisions are made from the top is getting the other allies to contribute more. They're not contributing what they can contribute to this fight.
Ms. Masiko, how would you analyze that? How important is it for Congress, for our administration,
to be vocal about our support and our continued support, and also for our allies, for NATO to step up. How does that play not just on the Ukrainians, but on the Russians as well?
So I was in the Pentagon in 2014, the first time Russia invaded, and I could say that the response from this government is fundamentally very different. Our intel collection prior to the war is very different. Our response is very different. I do think the Russians are deterred from the upper end of their escalation. I think they remain absolutely terrified of our air power. They don't engage us in cyber attacks.
Are we too slow in getting to Ukraine what they need?
I don't have all the information, but it's my assumption that logistics to get these weapons dug out of every corner from different parts of the globe is complicated logistically. From what I understand from the outside, I don't think it's a deliberate metering of things not to give it to them. I think there's a lot that's complicated in getting it to them. I don't know how to improve the logistics.
But to show our resolve in getting it there is important?
I do.
Thank you. Dr. Stent, how would you respond?
I would, it seems to me that we've been doing this incrementally, and we first of all say we're not going to send this system,
Then we do.
and then we do send it. And so in the end, we do the right thing, but probably some of these things could have been sent more quickly. And I think obviously what we're all awaiting now is what the outcome of this question about whether we're going to supply them with fighter jets, the F-16s, will be.
Air power earlier would have prevented some of the devastation we see on their infrastructure within their own country and made them more reliant on the United States and our allies, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I think so.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator King, please. Excuse me, Senator Kelly, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator King. General Kellogg, and for everybody here today, thank you for testifying. I want to follow up a little bit on Senator Fisher's questions about the aid we've given to Ukraine. As you know, the United States, in this close partnership with Ukraine, we provided, I think the number to date is $29.8 billion in security assistance. Since this brutal attack occurred around a year ago. Equipment from the United States has included everything from ammunition, grenades, bombs, NVDs, HIMARS, 155 millimeter artillery pieces, fire radars, much of what's in our inventory. Not everything, but much. And I also want to commend our allies for their support. Nearly 50 countries providing $13 billion in security assistance, most recently agreeing to provide tanks. And this is going to be critical for Ukraine with the approach that they're going to need to take this spring. So General Kellogg, can you provide your assessment on the effectiveness of both U.S. and partner military equipment? If you see any gaps, if there's something you think is not working well and something that we should address, a gap in capability, I'd like to hear that. And then from a combat assessment, what has provided the greatest return on investment for the Ukrainians? And what do you think the most important thing for us to continue to supply? If you have a sense for, what I heard when I was in Munich a couple of weeks ago was that they need 155 millimeter artillery shells, that supply is going down. They also made some other requests, some of which we're going to deal with here in the United States Senate. But if you could share your assessment, I'd appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, what you really need is all the equipment you just mentioned, but more. We developed a package during the Cold War called Assault Breaker. Assault Breaker were the Abrams tanks, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Paladin 155 self-propelled howitzer, the Apache fighting system. All of those systems together allowed us to fight in a combined arms fashion. A combined arms fashion assault will break the Russians' back. The Russians are not capable of handling that. But we haven't given them the full suite. We haven't given the Ukrainians ATACMS. That's the long-range missile that fits into the pod of either a HIMARS or the MLRS system out there. It gives you extended range of 200 miles. It's GPS guided. It can attack their supply lines deep. We've only given them 31 tanks. 31 tanks is a battalion. You need much more than that. Give them brigade levels so they can actually fight combined arms. And then maybe you have to do it separately. You give the Europeans with the Challenger tanks from Britain, maybe they have one unit.
You know,
have the
my
Americans.
sense is, in discussing with, our highest military leadership, including, folks on the Joint Chiefs, that they are capable of using combined arms to fight. I think what you might be alluding to is they need to do it at a bigger scale.
Correct, Senator.
Certainly there are gaps. I mean, they're not using, nor do they have Apache helicopters. That would be another issue. But being able to combine ground troops with, artillery, with long-range fires is something I think they've done rather effectively, maybe not at the scale that you think.
Not at the scale that is needed to win.
So give me a sense of what you feel the greatest return on our investment has been from the standpoint of equipment that we have provided them.
I would believe the best system that we have given them is the HIMARS system. That is the one that has given deep fires, and the fires that have been able to compensate and overcompensate for the Russian fires. So if you have to pick artillery, generally, even I'm an old infantryman, artillery will win your fights. And we need to give them as much artillery to dominate that. Plus one other system that is not really a military hardware system in the sense it's kinetic, but we need to give them more advanced intelligence systems that is able to use jammers, because the Russians are using jammers to great effect right now, especially against the drones the Ukrainians have had. It's something we haven't really done. We probably should do more.
All right, I appreciate that. If I could just take another 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman. The HIMARS they view as it was a game changer for them. And I agree. That is, a good example of a weapon system that has been very effective and really, changed the momentum in this fight. Beyond that, what would be the next thing you think would be a game changer for them?
Well, again, sir, what I just talked about, it's not a kinetic system, but the ability to do the anti-jamming in the intelligence type of collection and electronic warfare. The Russians do that very, very well, and that's causing problems with the drones of the Ukrainians as well. It's also able to target the Ukrainians much deeper. It's something that is really not thought about because it may not be sexy, but the fact is those are the kind of systems they need to support. It allows better targeting, longer range targeting, and with greater effects on the battlefield.
Right. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Cotton, please.
I want to thank all of the witnesses for their very informative testimony. General Kellogg, I especially appreciate your testimony. It's clear-eyed and hard-nosed, as you would expect from a seasoned statesman and military man like yourself who spent a lot of time on the battlefield and less time in the halls of the Pentagon. So thank you. Because I think there are some important lessons for the administration and Democrats to learn and also Republicans to learn. I just want to revisit a few points of your testimony to make sure I have it correct. It sounds like one key point you're making is it's possible to support Ukraine without supporting President Biden's Ukraine policy. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if I could synthesize the critique I've heard about President Biden's Ukraine policy, maybe down to a few points. First, in 2021, he did what Winston Churchill cautioned that we should never do with dictatorships, but especially Russia, gave them temptations to a trial of strength by giving away the store on the New START Treaty and Nord Stream 2, turning the cheek on the colonial pipeline hack, inviting him to a big summit in Europe. Is that one part of your critique? Is that President Biden tempted Vladimir Putin to achieve what he's always wanted to achieve, which is subjugating Ukraine to a new Russian empire?
Yes, Senator, it does. Senator, I'm a big believer in patterns. We all have patterns. We go to the store the same way, buy the same service station, and so do leaders. And Putin saw in the leadership of President Biden a pattern, and he was able to exploit it.
Second, over the year of the war, it sounds to me like your critique is that President Biden and the administration have been pussyfooting around their support for Ukraine. It's constantly providing them just enough to avoid a catastrophic defeat, not enough to win. It's, as you say, a pattern we've seen from the very beginning. We'll give them ammunition, but not artillery. We'll give them artillery, but not HIMARS. We'll give them HIMARS, but not armor. We'll give them Bradleys but not Abrams. We'll give them Abrams but not cluster munitions and F-16, which is where we are now. And therefore, these dragged out the war longer than we should have if we had just provided Ukraine with what it needed to defend its territory from the very beginning. Am I right about that?
You're correct, Senator. Senator, and you'll appreciate this. It's like doing a river crossing. Once from the near bank to the far bank, you don't get in the middle on a river crossing and decide it was not a good idea.
Yeah.
Once you commit, you go.
And to a point you were making earlier, and Senator Kane discussed with you, is that President Biden keeps talking about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, which is a substitute for helping Ukraine win as quick as it can. Is that right?
I believe so, because if this goes to a long-range fight, it's an endless war, and they cannot win a war of attrition.
Yeah, so from the beginning, it shouldn't have been about supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. It should be helping them win as quick as they can. For the record, Senator Kane talked a lot about seeing through the rearview mirror. I think you were making these very points a year ago, weren't you, when you were looking through the windshield, not the rearview mirror?
Correct, sir.
And I think a lot of us were. And then the third critique, after the first one, that President Biden tempted Vladimir Putin to go for the jugular, and then he spent a year pussyfooting around in its support for Ukraine, is that he's also allowed Europe to get away with not doing enough, especially on financial support, and in particular, Germany, France, and the European Union. Is that right?
I believe Europe has been very laggard.
Okay. Now, I also hear you making a few other points as well that I want to pursue. Sometimes we hear criticism of President Biden that he seems to care more about Ukraine's borders than America's borders. I think that's a fair criticism of President Biden. But it sounds like you believe that it's the case that you can care about America's borders and protect our borders while also help other countries protect their borders too. Is that right?
That is correct, Senator.
Or recently, since the terrible train wreck in East Palestine, Ohio, and President Biden's trip to Kyiv last week, I've heard some say that the president will go to Kyiv, but he won't go to East Palestine. I agree, that's a fair criticism of President Biden. It sounds to me like you think it's possible to both go to East Palestine and support the people there who've been harmed by this train wreck, but also travel to Kyiv and show our support for the Ukrainian people in their fight against this war of aggression from Russia. Is that right?
My experience is that Air Force One can about go anywhere it wants to go.
Thank you for that. Now, in negotiations, we also hear a lot of criticism that we're not doing enough to have a negotiated end to this conflict, that we need to get negotiations underway. I think one of your key points in terms of supporting Ukraine now, backing them to the hilt as quick as we can, not for as long as it takes, is that the only way to get a negotiated settlement is to convince Vladimir Putin he has more to lose on the battlefield than he does at the negotiating table. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator. And what you need to push pressure on him, if he loses his army, he loses, and that's what you put him at risk of.
So this idea that, well, if we stop supporting Ukraine or if we gradually draw down our support for Ukraine, then we'll magically have a negotiated settlement that protects America's interests. What you're saying is that no, what we would do is further embolden Vladimir Putin, exactly what Joe Biden did in 2021, to try to achieve maximalist gains, first in Ukraine and then down the road against NATO partners. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator. It's fool's gold if you think you can reduce aid.
Okay. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Blumenthal, please.
Thank you all for your testimony, which has been very helpful and instructive, and General Kellogg, particularly to you, thank you for your service. I have visited Ukraine 3 times over roughly the last year. The last 2 of them with Senator Graham, taking the overnight train into Kyiv. And I respect particularly, General, your visit to Ukraine and the lessons that you've learned. One of the lessons that come to me over this past year is that the world, and particularly the United States, has consistently underestimated the Ukrainians. I came back from my first trip before the invasion, telling anyone who would listen, including the president, that the Ukrainians were going to fight to the last person with pitchforks if necessary. That is what President Zelensky told me, and he wasn't leaving that country. So I have strong confidence in Ukrainians, which has been bolstered by my visit just 10 days ago to the U.S. Army base in Bavaria, where American soldiers are training Ukrainians in the use of those Bradley armored vehicles. And to quote one of them, they are quick studies, as you would expect. when you're defending your homeland, your children, your family, as we would be Americans. In fact, the American soldiers training them said to me, you know, they fight just like we do. So I have come back from each of these visits urging more military aid, more Stingers and Javelins, more of the air defense. Senator Graham and I came back last July urging that we provide the Patriot system, which we did after some hesitation and caution, in fact, delay. And now I am urging that we provide the F-16s, the air support that are necessary, the aircraft that they say are necessary for them to break through the air defenses that the Russians have established. Would you agree with me, General, that we should provide the F-16 and begin training those pilots immediately?
Senator, I would provide them everything we could possibly provide them to win this fight, because it prevents American troops being deployed later if they can defeat the Russian military. And if it takes the F-16, because it does have better avionics than the MiG-29 does, and you could upload the HARM-88 missiles as an example, the answer is I'd provide everything they can.
What I've heard repeatedly, and not just from the administration, from some on both sides of the aisle here, that providing these weapon systems is too complicated, too costly, too difficult in terms of training. What I saw and what I've heard from our American military is that the training obstacles can be overcome, and the costs of failing to provide these weapon systems now will be greater later. We'll pay more in terms of costs if we have to commit troops after one of our NATO allies is involved or attacked than we would now, because right now President Zelensky doesn't want and doesn't need American troops on the ground. He wants the weapon systems that he needs to win the war. Would you agree?
I totally agree, Senator. Look, my experience with the Ukrainians is those that follow the Ukrainians, they're very capable, they're very smart, it's a very educated population, and they're fighting for the life of their country, and they will devote everything they can to do it. Yes, sir.
There is a hitch here. It's the challenge that I regard as really paramount right now here in the United States, which is our defense industrial base. ATACMS. I fully support providing ATACMS, but what I have been told is that we don't have enough right now, that we need to produce more. The same with some of the ammunition that's been mentioned. We need to produce more of it. We need trained workforce that will provide the skills and the person power that's needed. Would you agree that we need to focus on the production of these weapon systems, not just talk about what's needed on the battlefield?
Sir, absolutely. And the defense industry is working on a peacetime schedule. We ought to get them to a wartime footing to actually ramp up the equipment that they're providing, which is actually backfilling the American military, which is more modern equipment. And the Stinger line was shut down for years. We need to bring those lines back on to make sure and actually put the entire defense industry on a wartime footing, not only get the munitions that are needed to defeat the Russians, by the Ukrainians defeating the Russians, but also to bring our stocks back up to good levels.
I hope we can have bipartisan agreement on that last point that you made, General, because I think it is the key to meeting those needs on the Ukrainian battlefield and being prepared to send a message to China, continued message about our resolve. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Scott, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank each of you for being here. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for answering all these questions. General Kellogg, we've seen the atrocities. We know Russia is a despicable government. Our heart goes out to the Ukrainians for all their losses. It's, when you see that Putin is sitting there wanting to kill women and children, it's just despicable. But if you were thinking about it just from the standpoint of American security, how important is this to American security that we make sure that the Ukrainians win and Russia loses? And if the opposite happened, how adverse would that be on our own our own security, which is our primary role up here in Congress, is provide for the security of Americans?
Thank you, Senator. Senator, I believe if you can defeat a strategic adversary not using any U.S. troops, you're at the acme of professionalism, because letting the Ukrainians defeat that, it takes a strategic adversary off the table, and then we can focus where we should be focusing against our primary adversary, which is China at this time. The concern I've got is I don't think we need to put American troops there, and if we fail in this, we may have to fight another European war, which would be the third time. And I don't think we should do that or need to do that as well.
General, why? I think we have to worry about. We need to make sure Russia loses. In my opinion, we need to make sure the Ukrainians win. Why hasn't Germany stepped up? I mean, this is not. I don't know how many miles it is from the Ukrainian border to Germany, but why hasn't Germany stepped up and done its part on lethal aid? I mean, it seems to me that they should have a bigger concern than we do.
I believe Germany is a non-player in Europe right now. I think you look more toward the Poles as being the major player. While it's a very obviously important country, I think they're feckless. They just haven't supported as they should support. They should be all in this fight because they've seen the experience of us coming over in 2 years and actually defeating Germany in 2 wars. The leadership they have gotten has not displayed the leadership you would expect from a wartime leader.
Do you think that, there's a lot of people believe that we can negotiate a settlement with Putin. Is there any type of settlement you believe that Putin, one, would be interested in doing, and then two, that would be worth anything he agreed to?
Senator, I believe, and I believe the 2 experts to my right would say this, the only thing that Putin understands is power and strength, and you have to basically put your knee on his throat. And how you do that is defeat the only thing that really counts for Putin, and that's the Russian army in Ukraine. Defeat that army, and I believe Putin falls.
Is there any, a lot of what we hear is we've spent a lot of money. Germany's not, they've not done the lethal aid, they've done other types of aid, but how can we quantify to the American public the importance of this? Because, some people, like in my state, they ask me why we spent over 100, or committed, not spent, but committed $100 billion. And is there a way that we can make sure the Biden administration does what I think a lot of us believe in, is we need to go all in now rather than piecemeal?
Senator, I believe it's fight there rather than here. It's better that we have to fight an adversary overseas and not use U.S. troops to do so. And the Ukrainians don't want U.S. troops. Everyone I talked to said we can fight this fight as long as we get the kit to do it. And I think if we don't, we need to tell the American people you can basically walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. We should be addressing all of those issues that we have, both here in the United States and overseas. And I think that balance can be displayed. And I think that needs to be done, which I believe through presidential leadership. I think the president should pick up the phone if he has to and call President Putin. Even right now, when you see Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, they will not pick up the phone and talk to him, nor will the Chinese. And I think that's a huge mistake.
So what's the takeaway for Xi right now with regard to how the Biden administration has acted, and how when you look at part of the American public questions what we're doing there? What's Xi's takeaway?
Well, the huge takeaway is that we're in a drift. We're not displaying presidential leadership. What I mean by presidential leadership is being very, very definitive on what it's going to take to win this fight. We're saying a backseat and letting Ukraine drive this decision. This decision is a free world decision of how we fight and how we win on the battlefield. And I believe presidential leadership does count. Decisive leadership does count. And Putin needs to understand that decisive leadership and that he is actually fighting us and the free world in this endeavor.
Thank each of you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator King, please.
Thank you. I think, General Kellogg, the Germans would be surprised to be called feckless. They've made about a 180-degree turn in their orientation toward conflict and arms and armament. And I think clearly the United States has been the major donor, if you will, both in terms of military and humanitarian aid, in terms of dollars. But I think, I was in Munich last week, I think in terms of percentage of GDP, we're like 12th behind a lot of other countries, particularly Poland, which has stepped up in an enormously consequential way, both with regard to refugees, acting as a conduit for weapons, So I don't, I just don't think it, I just don't think it's accurate to say that the rest of the world and Europe is not stepping up, because as a percentage of their economy, they're actually countries that are doing more than we are. I do have a specific question about, and I think General Kellogg, you'll agree with me on this one, and that is, we go through these long debates about whether to send tanks, whether to send jet fighters. Then if we decide yes, as we've learned with the tanks, there's this long lag time, 3 or 4 months, that mostly involves training. It seems to me that one way to shorten that is to say, well, we haven't decided yet about jet aircraft or tanks, but let's do the training now. Does that make sense?
Senator really does train now with any system they've got and prepare for the future. I think it's there. So I spent 5 years in Germany. The Germany I remember when I was there, it's been 5 years in there, is not the Germany I see today, both in leadership and their military capacity and capability. So I understand it's a harsh statement, but I stand by the statement as well. But you're absolutely right. If we can train them on all the systems that we may provide them, they're very smart, they're very quick learning, and I think it would help out.
Professor Stent, a question about, one of the things that's puzzling to me, I remember when this started a year ago, all the talk was the sanctions are going to cripple Russia. They're going to be just out of business and riots in the street. Absolutely hasn't worked. Talk to me about why were they the wrong sanctions? Were they not applied well? Did we underestimate the Russian capacity to circumvent them? Why have the sanctions regime not played a bigger part in this conflict?
So I think we always tend to think the first reaction to something like the Russian invasion is to impose sanctions. I think we forget how resilient that Russian economy is despite the sanctions. The IMF said that Russia's economy was going to contract by 8% last year. It contracted by 2%. They have been able to do this because they've had a smart policy of stabilizing the ruble, and because they have earned, windfall profits last year from their oil and gas sales. And they've managed to keep the war machine going despite sanctions. That's changing now. We have the oil price cap. They probably won't make those windfall profits anymore, but still, India has now become the largest purchaser of Russian oil, other countries, China. So they do still sell their hydrocarbons, even though the Europeans have now weaned themselves off the Russian imports.
Don't you think we underestimate other countries, particularly a country like Russia, their ability to absorb pain?
Yeah, I think we do.
They go back, he's invoking Stalingrad.
Yes.
And also, sanctions against a dictatorial regime, the problem is the dictator will always have his Mercedes and caviar. And so the sanctions don't directly affect, and if it's a country that doesn't have much in the way of political opposition, then I'm not sure where the sanctions go. Are there additional sanctions we should be applying now?
I mean, there's still some Russian banks we could sanction. We've sanctioned many of them. I think we also misunderstand the relationship between Putin and the oligarchs. I mean, and the people who lost their bank accounts and their yachts and everything else. They're not going to get together and say, we have to rid ourselves of this leader. That's not how the system works.
That hasn't worked.
Right. I think the only other thing I would say is that I think the export control sanctions will bite more this year, particularly the lack of access to semiconductors and components for manufacturing. So the Russians already started closing down some assembly lines with automobiles and things like that. And that will then hit the general population more. But so far,
that's where I want to follow up, Ms. Massacote. What's the status of the Russian defense industrial base? How are they going to be able to keep producing ammunition and weapons?
Well, we found since the beginning of the last year of war that Putin has delayed decisions that he thinks are risky, well beyond when he should have done. Russia has not activated its full wartime authorities to command that defense industrial base to really go 24/7. There are some sectors of it that are. My understanding is that some of their longer range precision munitions, they're working triple shifts to try to get those missile stocks back up. My understanding is that artillery shells is pretty simple for them to construct if they have the access to the raw materials, which they do. There is a bit of a delay right now. I think they'll probably overcome it by the fall, maybe the late winter. So in the interim, I'm not sure what they're going to do. I know they're trying to get it from North Korea. They're trying to get it from China.
Well, The big question, and I know it's been covered, I was in another hearing downstairs, but the big question is, will China bail them out? And is there a yes or no answer to that? What do we think? What do we think China's going to do? Are they going to, so far they've been content to stand on the sidelines and hold Russia's coat. Are they going to actually step in and start supplying weapons?
I think there probably is an answer for a China expert. I'm not that person, but I would say that if they did intervene right now, it would fill a critical gap for the Russians for the next several months. I'm not sure if they'll do it.
Raises the question of what our response is to that. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Schmidt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple of questions, but let me try to give voice to what I think a lot of folks out there who are not sitting in these chairs feel about where we're at with regard to this policy. They have seen an administration disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Hundreds or tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment left behind, critical intelligence. They are told about this respecting the sovereignty of other countries' borders, but do nothing about the millions of people streaming across our southern border and the fentanyl that's killing 300 people a day in every single one of our communities, the violence, the humanitarian crisis, human beings being trafficked by drug cartels. They see a president go to Ukraine before he goes to Ohio, where there is a toxic chemical spill. And a lot of people who feel forgotten in all this are frustrated. And so I suppose my first question, I guess to all of you, briefly, because I have limited time, is $113 billion. Now, we can talk about percentage of GDP, but for most folks out there, that's a lot of money. $1 billion is a lot of money. $113 billion is a lot of money when you have a porous open border. In fact, it's more money than we spend on the Department of Homeland Security every year. What can be done to ensure that these dollars are fully accounted for beyond what we're doing right now? And I guess that's the first question I have for each of you, if you have a point of view on that.
Well,
Senator.
Sorry.
Oh, go on.
Senator, my understanding is that we do have mechanisms in place. This has been discussed this
Well, my
morning
question
as
is,
well. Yeah.
let's say you're not satisfied with that. What else can be done?
Senator, I think you can provide more. We don't have, for example, a special Inspector General that's currently in Kyiv. We should probably put a full team on board to make sure that the accountability is there. It's a matter of emphasis. And what you saw, we had the same thing in Afghanistan and places like that before, where you put a special IG that's able to track all of that. So if you're saying what to do more, that's kind of what I would say. And the Ukrainians are very willing to accept that. They understand they've got corruption issues. They told us that when we were there. They're not running from it. You know, I think it would behoove us to actually improve that accountability. And the second, you asked a great question. I think we have a terrible messaging problem to the American people. Right now, we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. You can do all of this if you want to. You just have to be committed to it. And I don't think we are committed to it.
Well, and let me just, so we've heard a lot about this, existential threat to Ukraine and to Europe. I suppose, again, part of the frustration is the American people, the American taxpayers, they don't see these European countries stepping up. They just don't, and we can talk about percentage of GDP, but Germany has walked away. There's other countries in Europe that could be doing a lot more. And so I guess my question is, General Kellogg, to you, what specifically can those European countries do? This is in their backyard. And you mentioned, fight them there or fight them here. I don't know if that's I don't think that most Americans believe that we're at a point where we're going to be fighting the Russians on American soil. So we're in the European theater here. What can these European countries do to step up? Because they got a lot of money for a lot of their social welfare programs in those countries, but they don't seem to have a lot of money for this, existential threat.
Well, the comment you made is accurate because, for example, as I said, use the Kiel Institute, which tracks this very, very well. Only 6% of the European stocks in the European Union of military stocks have been used. Unlike the Brits, who 25% of their stock has been used. They do need to step up more. And how you get them to step up more, very candidly, is do what President Trump did, is stand up and use the presidency as a bully pulpit and say, this is what needs to get done. And we need to tell them that. We cannot be continuing to expect that the United States of America will carry 50% of the load. And that's what it's carrying when you analyze these other 41 countries. It's in their backyard. You know, over a year ago, before this war started, I said, this is a European fight. It is before an American fight. But once the fight was joined, I said, okay, now we're into the game. Now we have to fight. But yes, you're absolutely correct. They're not doing enough, but you have to get the president willing to say that and force them to do that. And they're not doing that right now. And we're not pushing them, and they're not supporting to the degree they should support.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Senator Rosen, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. Of course, Ranking Member Wicker isn't here, but we really appreciate that you're holding this timely hearing on the ongoing war in Ukraine, which sadly comes shortly after the one-year anniversary of Putin's brutal and unjustified invasion over Ukraine's sovereign territory. And as I've said before, the United States and our allies, I believe, must stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes for the Ukrainian people to win. Now is not the time to back down, especially with spring. As we know, the weather presents an opportunity for Ukrainian counteroffensive. So, Ms. Mazzicat, what is your assessment of the ability to rapidly and effectively provide some of these newer weapon systems and advanced technologies to Ukraine? And I want to also bring up this point. How can the Pentagon, do you believe, improve its acquisition system to quickly adopt and maybe field some of the off-the-shelf technologies that are going to enable Ukraine off the battlefield, things that we can do there?
Thank you, Senator. I think about needs for Ukraine on two different timelines. There's the immediate needs, which we've talked about, artillery shells and additional small arms to prevent these Russian frontal assaults. I think some of the more advanced systems that we've talked about today, like the F-16s or ATACMS, there is a lead time with that with training, but I agree with my panelists, if you never start the process, you never start the process. Right. You know, when the war kicked off, I believed that it was really urgent for the Ukrainians to receive air defense systems, and I still think that's a really urgent thing that we must sustain. Mm-hmm. The Russians are working at chipping away at that over time with missile salvos at Ukrainian cities using Iranian Shahed drones. If they're able to attrit those Soviet-era SAMs or some of our IRIS-T or NASAMs that have been provided, it would allow the Russian Air Force to come back in a very large way, and I worry that that would be very dangerous for the Ukrainians. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to move on. I'm going to come back to you, Ms. Mazzicat, but I want to move on to Dr. Stent, because we've been hearing some of the conversation here, but of course during Putin's address to the Russian people just last week, he reiterated his warnings to the West, and I'm going to quote, he said, global confrontation. And so, are his threats intended for our domestic consumption or for us here in the United States, just for domestic consumption inside Russia? Do you foresee a more aggressive Russia, thinking about his global confrontation posture, perhaps cyber, that he hasn't really played much? You say, well, maybe they don't see them marching here, but the cyber attacks can hit you pretty hard as well. So, Dr. Stent, what's your opinion on that?
Thank you, Senator. I think his speech was directed both to the domestic audience and to the foreign audience. He's telling his own people this war is a war with the West, with the United States. It's going to go on for a long time, and we're going to prevail. He said, we're going to win on the battlefield. And he's basically telling them that they have to accept it. And for us, he's threatening us that there are things that he hasn't done yet that he could do. Now, having said all of that, he wants to intimidate everyone. The Russians haven't done some things that we thought they might do. They have not attacked any of the convoys carrying weapons into Ukraine, either from Poland or Romania. I think at this point, Putin still is not willing to get into a direct conflict with NATO. And there has been less cyber. I mean, there have been obviously some issues, but there have been less cyber attacks than we maybe feared that there might be. So that indicates to me that until now, he is observing some of his own, I know, red lines or limits, but he wants us to believe that he could go much further. And so I think it's our task to try and discriminate between what are probably just empty threats and things that we should take seriously.
Thank you. And I'm going to build on that with you, General Kellogg, then, because we think about these threats, and of course they come maybe cyber, and they also come with missiles. And we know Russia's stockpile of missiles, they've fired thousands since the beginning. They're using their Soviet-era munitions more and more. So what do you believe is the status of Russian munitions and their supply chain, and how, if they're running low, as Ms. Massicott talked about, maybe having to move back up production, how will this counteract, how will this play in these counteroffensive, actually just in the next few months?
Senator, thank you. Senator, they're at a stretch right now. Look, Senator, they're refurbishing T-62 tanks. Those tanks have been out of the inventory for over 40 years. But the amount of losses they've sustained in their modernized armor forces have been tremendous. They're falling back on systems that we haven't seen in the inventory back in the Cold War, back when I was stationed in Germany years ago. So their stocks are running low. That doesn't mean they don't have a lot there, but you can see they're using munitions that are not guided. That's where I would get concerned where either Iranians or Chinese are going to step up and provide them the munitions they are currently don't have to be able to use. That's the reason why I believe the United States has an ability to continue to put pressure on them. And I realize it's a heavy lift, but the more we do it, it counters the Russian ability to continue to fight this war. They're basically, in my opinion, the Russians are on their heels, both tactically, operationally, and strategically, and their supply chain is being broken right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to submit a question for the record on what you all might think will be their next. If they're on their back heels, what you might predict will be their next form of aggression that we need to look forward to. But my time is up, so I will send that for the record. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Rosen. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their important testimony today. Just want to make a statement, Senator Schmidt's point about the Europeans doing more. General, you highlighted this, but I really think the 2% GDP commitment they've all made on their NATO membership is really important now. I hear from folks back home in Alaska that, you know, they know how important this is, but if the Europeans can't meet their commitments, you're going to continue to see waning support in America. And I think all our European allies need to understand that. So, but what I want to do is I want to turn to a topic that surprisingly hasn't come up yet, that I know a number of you, Dr. Stent in particular, know and care about. That's the topic of energy. And I'd like to recount this story. My good friend, Senator John McCain, and I were in a meeting with a very brave Russian a Russian who's actually now in jail, Vladimir Karamurza, and I had asked him, what more can we do to undermine the Putin regime? This is a number of years ago. And he said, Senator, the answer is very simple. Produce more American energy. So American energy is this huge, important instrument of American power. Do you all agree with Vladimir Karamurza's statement on just how important energy is, similar to tanks and aircraft carriers, relative to Russia and relative to China? Xi Jinping fears American energy dominance, which we did such a good job of during the Trump administration. This administration now, from day one, has actually been attacking American energy, trying to shut down American energy, make it harder to produce. Literally insane, makes no sense. But can you talk very briefly, because I have a number of questions, on the importance of American energy, not just for Americans, but as an instrument of American power it relates to Russia? Dr. Stent, why don't you begin? I know you and your husband know a little bit about energy.
Thank you, Senator. No, I mean, I would agree with you. Russia was an energy superpower before this war began. It will no longer be an energy superpower.
And we are, if we want to be, if we could be, if we had the federal government's not help, just get the hell out of the way, right?
Right, so there's obviously a contradiction between the administration's policy on hydrocarbons and what would actually be needed to make it less easy for Russia to project its own power. I agree with you.
Thank you. General, you have a view on that? I'm sure you do.
Senator, my family's an oil well drilling family, so yeah, I get it. Yes, sir.
And that's a really important instrument of American power if we're the world's energy dominant. By the way, all of the above. I want wind, solar, as long as we're not buying it from China. But oil and gas too, right?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Mascott, do you have a view on that?
I do. I think there are elements of sanctions that are less impactful. Russia is able to find alternative customers for its main imports.
But America producing energy as a way to undermine Putin's power is a no-brainer, isn't it?
I don't have an informed view, but that seems logical to me.
Okay. Let me, we're working on a project called the Willow Project. Just a quick, it's in Alaska. It's been under permitting, God knows how long, 20 years. It would be max production, about 200,000 barrels a day, 2,500 jobs to build it. We could start building it tomorrow if we get the president to approve it. Would a project like that help America's national security, an additional 200,000 barrels a day? Highest environmental standards in the world. Just real quickly, yes or no to each of the witnesses, Dr. Stunt?
Yes.
General?
Yes.
Ms. Mascott? Was that a yes, no, maybe?
Outside my area of expertise.
Okay. And then finally, we have a member of the administration. He won't admit it, and maybe you should come out and deny it. Mr. Kerry, I'm not sure what to call him. He's not a senator. He's not a secretary of state. By the way, if we were up for confirmation, he wouldn't get confirmed in the Senate. He goes around the world, especially in Asia, cautioning countries not to buy American LNG. Is that a good idea from a national security perspective? Dr. Stent, do you have a view on that?
I think I'll pass on that one.
All right. General, how about you? Good idea to go to Asia and say, hey, don't buy American LNG?
No, I think that's a very good idea.
No, it's really ridiculously stupid. Let me just ask one final question. On the F-16s, and this is just for all of the witnesses, I hosted some Ukrainian pilots last summer, very brave, credible young men. We wrote a letter to General Milley, Secretary Austin, last summer on the F-16s. I was very well informed that the Pentagon was moving towards approving F-16s. We've been working on it for months. And then the president got off the helicopter the other day and said, no, we're not going to do it. He looked very uninformed, but whatever, that's not always surprising. The Washington Post today came out with an editorial on moving forward the F-16s. What I worry about is this administration is going to do what they've been doing the whole time, which is eventually approve them. Looked like they were gonna before the president's statement. So can you, any or all of you, just opine very quickly on why that's important, this weapon system now, not, 5 months from now like they've been doing on other ones?
Sure. The reason why those systems are important is American technology is the best in the world. Our fighters, our bombers, the stealth technology, you name it, is the best in the world, and we should give them the best to have those fights. So it makes sense to give them systems like that if they believe it can improve the fight. If the F-16 is an example, is it a good air-to-air and air-to-ground system out there? We can put the most modern avionics on it, most modern weapon systems. Give them, I've always said this repeatedly, give them the systems, the best systems in the world to win the fight. Those best systems happen to be, I believe, American systems.
Any other views on the F-16 in particular?
Yes, I just would like to caution that we can give them an air platform, but we can't give them Western air power. There's a lot of additional enablers that go into that. It's not my decision to make about what to send them, but it's not just the pilots that need to be trained. It's the spare parts, it's the logisticians, it's everything else that goes into it. And what do we assume risk-wise if we invest in that capability? Is there something that comes off the table for the Ukrainians in the near term? I don't have that answer, but you all do. And I know you're making very difficult decisions every day. Just there's risks involved in everything, and there's no easy ways forward now.
Dr. Stent, you have a view? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you for being here today. It's been quite a wide-ranging discussion. I think a lot of questions have already been asked that I was going to ask, but I'll be brief and just kind of drilling down on some of the responses that I've heard. On the last question about a weapon system of the F-16 and understanding that it's not just a platform, you got to have a whole system around those platforms and going into combat as well. It's a complicated combined arms type of tactics that you have to use. But one question I had is contribution that the Germans have made. There's been questions related to European contributions, and the Germans, I believe, made a pretty significant contribution with the Leopard 2 tanks. But I'm curious as to your assessment of that tank going into combat. Clearly, a tank by itself is not a game changer. It has to be part of a broader system. But Ms. Massicotte, General Kellogg, could you talk a little bit about what you think the Leopard 2 will bring to the defensive and offensive capabilities of the Ukrainian military?
Sir, it's one of the 3 best tanks in the world. When you look at that, I happen to think the Abrams tank made by the United States is the best tank in the world. The Challenger 2 system that the Brits are providing is very good, and so is the Leopard 2 system. They're all high quality. I think all 3 of them overmatch anything the Russians currently have. They fight them together. But at the same time, I'm saying that, put them together in sets. If you're going to put the Leopard system with it out in the field, put the Marder system, the personnel carrier with it. If you're going to put the Abrams in the field, you put the Bradley with it. The Challenger doesn't really have a sister vehicle as good as ours that is out there. You kind of put a Bradley with it as well. But those systems are very good. And I think they just need to commit to giving those systems. I think the Germans would admit they would prefer not to have the Russians back on their front doorstep again. So push those systems forward. They're all good systems. They overcompensate the Russian systems very, very, very well. And the Ukrainians can fight those systems. They're good enough, they're smart enough to figure them out.
Yeah, and they're training them right now. And you mentioned the T-62s that are being refurbished by the Russians. A Leopard is a good match for that one, isn't it?
It's beyond a good match, sir. It's an overmatch, which is okay by me.
Overmatch is always better.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Massicotte.
Well, I think we need a long-term strategy for Ukraine because they've been cut off from receiving all of their Russian equipment. And I think the Leopards are a start in that. I'm not sure how the Ukrainians are planning on using those in the year ahead, whether it's keeping them in reserve and keeping them back and putting some of the older equipment forward to engage with the Russians directly. But counteroffensives are hard. They're hard for the Ukrainians, and it's not just tanks that will enable that success. It needs continued U.S. and Western intelligence support and planning guidance.
Well, clearly, you need more than just tanks. You need artillery, and you need air support, you need intelligence, all of those factor. That's just part of the list, yes. A long list of what's necessary. One of the weapon systems that is changing warfare dramatically, and I think we saw this in Azerbaijan, was the use of drones. And drone warfare continues to advance pretty rapidly, and we're going to see increased developments as AI systems power drones as well. My question to you is, Iran is now providing drones. Do we have any assessment as to how those drones are being used? Are they effective? Give me a sense of what you think that's bringing to the battlefield, Iran's involvement working with Russia in regards to drones. Ms. Massicotte, you want to start, and then General Kellogg?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, the Shahed drones, they don't exactly have very large payload, but it is complicating the picture for Ukrainian defenders. In the early days when Russia introduced that capability into Ukraine, Ukrainians were using surface-to-air missiles to engage those drones. That is a really quick way to attrit that capability. And they've changed over time. I think they're using anti-aircraft guns now. They're doing other things to bring those down. There are rumors that Russia and Iran are potentially going to open up some kind of production capability inside Russia to create hundreds of those. That is a way for Russia to augment its precision strike capabilities. I mean, again, the payload is very small. They're using it to go after soft targets, cities. It stresses Ukrainian defenses. And I think that's another issue we have to really look at is the status of Ukrainian air defense interceptor missiles.
Talk a little bit more about the production that we may see in Russia.
From what I understand, the rumors in the press, there would be a Iranian-Russian effort to produce, I think, a few hundred drones. That's what I saw in the press.
Okay. General Kellogg?
Iran's got a massive drone inventory, and they've figured out how to use these primarily when they used them against the Saudis. They use kamikaze drones and swarm technology, and putting massive amounts of drones against Ukrainians that the Ukrainians just can't manage all of those targets at the same time. So the fact is that giving all of these drones actually changes the nature of the battlefield. Individually, though. They're effective, but they're not going to change the nature of the battlefield. But you put them in combination with your artillery, your ground forces as well, then it starts to change. It's a new technology. Iranians have perfected it, and they're passing that to the Russians.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Peterson. We've been having a discussion about who gives what, how much, et cetera. And General Kellogg, you've made reference to the Kiel Institute, I believe, in terms of some of your comments. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Well, they have an interesting chart that shows, and it's based on gross domestic product, because that's the only, I think, reasonable way to measure the capacity as well as the commitment of a country. In that chart, which I'll make available to you, the United States is 10th in its contribution, because what it includes also is the absorption of immigrants. You realize there are millions of Ukrainians who have left. The number 1 country is Estonia, 2 is Latvia, 3 is Poland, 4 is the Czech Republic, 5 is Lithuania, 6 is Slovakia, 7 Norway, 8 is Bulgaria, 9 is the United Kingdom, and the United States is 10th. And Germany, who we've talked about, is 14th. So I think this graphically displays, from a very authoritative source, the level of commitment of our allies, which is astounding. In fact, frankly, I don't think it could be generated in the previous administration. Indeed, I'm still recoiling from President Trump's comment on the day of the invasion that Putin was a genius. Do you believe he's a genius?
I think Putin is not a genius, and he has proven that in spades.
Well, you might have a call with your former boss on that. And also, I think, just to clear up a confusion, your earlier response about the aircraft, you made a suggestion which I thought was absolutely brilliant, which is rather than F-16s, more MiGs, which they're familiar flying, would be a much more adequate platform. Is that true?
The MiG-29s, because they're so familiar with, it's a good aircraft. Is it as good as an American aircraft? No, but it's very effective against the Russians.
Right. So in terms of time, essence of being able to move quickly, those M29s could be flown almost immediately by their pilots.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I thought the panel was extraordinarily insightful. I want to thank you all, Dr. Stent, Ms. Massicott, General Kellogg. Again, thank you for your service, and as we said before, strike hold. Thank you, sir. With that, I'll adjourn the hearing. Thank you.